My guest today is Joe Jenks, who performed a wonderful concert in the series. So, Joe, welcome. It's good to see you.
Thank you. Likewise, good to see you too.
And it's especially good to see you in real time.
Here we are, indeed.
Yeah. So, so tell us a little bit about your background and growing up, your sort of musical beginnings.
I'm the youngest of seven children in my family of origin, and my folks had six kids, and then 8 years later, they had me. And all of my older siblings were musicians in one form or another, as were my parents, recreationally. Um, but music was just really part of the fabric of the household. Um, my dad's family was French Canadian, Quebecois, and also some Swedes in there, and a lot of some Welsh background in there. Music being integral to all of those cultures. My mom's family was Irish and Alsatian, and music is very integral to both of those cultures. So I think it was something they had grown up with as an integral part of daily life, and they passed that on to all of us. We would sing together in community. I sang in choirs growing up at church, a boys choir that was in the community. I did theater, and music was just really part of the fabric of daily life. And I think a lot of times people encourage young folks to chase what they're already good at. I really wanted to be an astronaut, frankly. But I think everybody knew that my math chops and my capacity for taking orders were both going to stand in between me and becoming an astronaut, because I didn't particularly love hard sciences. As an adult, I've come to love them deeply and wish that I had spent more time pursuing that as a young person. Especially now with SpaceX and, all these different ways in which humans are exploring into our solar system and beyond. And there is a place in the space program for people like me. There's a space for, creative people who don't have a hard science background necessarily to be part of a whole team of people that come up with creative and unorthodox solutions to problems. But that's a relatively modern, expansion of space. So for me, becoming a folk singer was a very pragmatic second choice. And you have to have something as absurd as wanting to be an astronaut as being at the top of your list for being a folk singer to be a logical second choice. But that's where I found my mojo. I went to conservatory, studied opera and jazz and music theater and all kinds of things. But through all of it, I was very clear that the long-term goal was to emulate my heroes, people like Pete Seeger and Holly Near and Cat Stevens, Woody Guthrie. I mean, I could list a whole bunch of them from the 20th century that had an impact on me, but those folks pretty immediately come to mind.
Great. And how did you encounter their music? I mean, folk music is not something that every American kid necessarily experiences. So how did it come to you?
Again, being the youngest of a large family, and chronologically, I'm the only one of my siblings that's not a baby boomer. The oldest sibling was born in 56. The one just up from me was born in 64, and I was born in 72. And so the older cohort all kind of chronologically are part of the boomer generation, even though they're on the younger side of it. And, I grew up with their records, but my mom was quite the adventurous listener of music. And so I'm guessing at a time when there weren't a lot of, middle-class white women in the United States listening to Harry Belafonte or listening to Bob Marley or listening to, Billie Holiday, Ella Fitzgerald. My mom was totally into it. She ran away from home when she was 16. She grew up in the country north of Chicago, but she ran away from home at 16 one night to go down to Bronzeville, to the south side of Chicago, to hear Gene Krupa's orchestra. And because it was a mixed race orchestra, they were not allowed to play in certain clubs in downtown or uptown Chicago. So they played in the black neighborhoods in Chicago. And, that's the kind of person she was. So she taught all of us to be adventurous. And so I grew up with all these old 78 recordings that were my mom's from when she was a teenager and going through her own form of rebellion, on up through the things that all of my siblings were listening to at different stages. And they were all part of the family record collection. And I explored every record in that collection. And so inside of that were, a lot of traditional Irish music. There was also, what, like a lot of the singer songwriters of the 70s, James Taylor and Dan Fogelberg and Cat Stevens and folks like that, Carla Bonoff. And, but when I was about 8 years old, my sister Jean gave me a present. She came home from college with a gift for me, and it was Pete Seeger and Arlo Guthrie live at Carnegie Hall. And that record really, again, 8 years old, I sort of had the hubris to presume that I had a pretty good handle on what folk music was, but that just blew the lid off of it for me, because I heard them sing songs about cultures from all over the world. And I wanted to understand those cultures. And as I began to, familiarize myself with, I think from there I jumped into the project that Holly Near and Arlo and Pete and Ronnie Gilbert did together, the Harp Project. And my mom connected me to the Weavers from there. And I really started to appreciate the diversity of what was possible in folk music. From there, again, Harry Belafonte and a lot of African-American singer-songwriters and performers in the jazz world and big band era stuff. But I began to appreciate that music could become the vessel that I sailed out into the world to explore what was possible in the world, to explore other cultures, that it could be my passport into any situation. Because I don't know, like the old clan wars in Scotland, there were all these people, duking it out with swords and battle axes. And then there was a few folk up on the hill with their pipes and drums, just kind of, doing their thing. And I think if I'd been born in that time, I would have been one of those people. It's like, don't shoot the piper, don't shoot the piano player, like there's just this sense that music is often a vehicle for diplomacy. It's a way to build bridges. It's a way to build connections, even with people who don't share a common language or a common culture. And I think that captivated me as a young person, and it still does. It still fascinates me that music carries the narrative and the stories that touch us. Sometimes, even if we don't understand the language, I can hear a melody in a different tongue and still be moved by it, and still get a sense of longing or a sense of yearning or a sense of celebration out of that music. And there is something that we share as human beings through the music that runs very deep into our biology and transcends the unique cultures that we have created.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And one of the things that I notice in your sort of description of your background that maybe is a little different from some folk singers is the emphasis on music. And you said, you went to conservatory, and these are things that some folk singers are more like, casual about that aspect of it. But I think in many ways it serves you well to get real musical training. What gave you that insight early on that was how to do it, to become a folk singer?
Well, one of my cousins, David Kilbride, is a marvelous violinist. My sister Jen is a great musician, multi-tool player. Like she started out really focused on classical violin, but ultimately went into music therapy. And she spent time doing a lot of different things with music. And between the two of them, they sort of opened my eyes a little bit to the classical world. But I think it was probably my 12th birthday that my best friend Doug Compton gave me a cassette tape that he had dubbed from vinyl onto cassette. And it had on one side Ozzy Osbourne, the Black Sabbath album that had Iron Man on it, and Electric Funeral, just classic Black Sabbath stuff. And on the other side was Vivaldi's Four Seasons. And, it just, I have to look back at that moment and go that I felt deeply witnessed by my best friend at that time, that he understood that these were two sides of the same cassette for me, that they were both forms of music that were trying to say something in their time and in their place and in their own way. Um, and as I continued to pursue theater and pursue liturgical music, I was involved in the guitar mass choir at the Catholic church that I was raised in, which was great training as a musician, because somebody's throwing you a new set of repertoire every Wednesday and you have to have it up to speed by Sunday morning. It was great training for being a working musician to do music in that environment. But I
Sure.
started playing out, open mics when I was probably 13, 14. I had a gig with the Rockford Park District. I grew up in Rockford, Illinois. And every Saturday night in the summer, or every other Saturday night, depending on the year, um, I'd be playing this little riverboat, the Forest City Queen, and I'd get paid for playing two sets, one set on the way up to watch a water ski show and one set on the way back. And people on the boat would get a little box dinner, like a box lunch thing. And so I had to learn all kinds of covers, and I'd sneak in my own songs. But while my friends were making 3.25 flipping burgers, I was making 50 or 60, sometimes $75 a night to play music on a riverboat. And so I was also somebody who was, uniquely, that represented economic growth for me as a young person. Folk music was a path of economic advancement. And I think
Nice.
it's also a testimony to just how minimal the resources were in my life and in the town I grew up with, that music represented economic advancement. For most people, it's a step backwards. But in terms of going to conservatory, it was my mother that really pushed me. I would have been just as happy to pursue something else, or just to try and hit the road right out of high school and see if I could make a go of it. And my mom sat me down and said, look, if you want to be a musician, that's great, but you need to equip yourselves with all of the tools needed to do this work. You can't do this in a half-baked way. So if you want to be a musician, your father and I will get behind you, but you pick a good school and you go and you study and you give it everything you have. You don't do this halfway. It's all or nothing. And
Well, moms are wonderful things, aren't they?
well, I just feel so blessed. I mean, I hear stories from so many of my colleagues where they tell me that they had to fight their parents tooth and nail in order to, sort of get their blessing to pursue some creative passion. And here my parents were just like shoving me, fully into it. But I think that's also the benefit, again, of being the youngest of a large family, because when a couple of my older siblings expressed, a serious interest in pursuing music, I think they got more of the talk about, well, it's a hard way to make a living. You better have something to fall back on. You can always do music, but you should go study something else. And, when it came to me, it was very much like, okay, well, but if you're going to do it, go all the way.
So you mentioned that in some of your first gigs, you were playing a lot of covers, but then you would slip in a few of your own songs as well. How did you get your start as a songwriter?
Oh, well, I would say in earnest, I really started taking songwriting much more seriously in my early and mid-teens. But the first song that I wrote, I was 8 years old. And all of my older siblings, well, not all of them, but at least four of them were songwriters. And, so we'd have campfire songs, or, when we'd get together for the holidays or whatever, the instruments would come out and people would play songs that they had written. And, so when I was 8, the next youngest sibling was 16. And I just remember waking up. We were up in Minnesota camping and visiting my grandmother. And I just remember waking up in the tent one morning and staring at, the shadow of the leaves on the roof of the tent and thinking, by God, I'm 8 years old. It's time I pick up this thing that is my heritage, and it's what my people do. It's time I start writing songs. I mean,
Nice.
I think about it now. I look back on it and go, wow, what a strange kid. You know?
Yeah. Well,
But
there, it's never too early to start
well,
with
it
something
just
like
seemed like
songwriting.
what my people did. And I think I had this sense because of the music that I listened to. I was such an oddball. When all of my friends were listening to heavy metal and acid rock and all kinds of stuff, that I was, I mean, they'd ask me to play Ozzy Osbourne, play Crazy Train. And I would do this, totally folked up version of Crazy Train, and my friends would just be like, nah, don't play Crazy Train. And I wanted nothing to do with electric instruments, which is really funny because a luthier that I have a long-standing relationship with built this instrument for me that's over my shoulder here. It's an electric bouzouki, which is in the mandolin family. And I started out, mandolin was my first instrument when I was 5. And as I got older, my fingers just got too big and stubby to really pull off mandolin. And I know there's people with big fingers that do it, but I don't know how they do it. I had always wanted to get a mandolin again, but something bigger. And I got a bouzouki that the same luthier built for me. And then a couple of years ago, he built this electric one for me. And I don't understand why I was so ideologically entrenched as a younger musician around not playing electronic instruments. Because I've had so much fun with this and it's opened so many doors for me creatively. But in another sense, I'm really glad I saved it till middle age so that, getting a pedal board and an amp and, trying on distortion could be my middle age crisis as opposed to, something far worse. But yeah, I don't know. It's just, it's an interesting thing. I mean, we try and categorize music. We try and say, this is this genre and this is that genre and this is this thing over here. But I think when you study music deeply, you see the connections. And if nothing else, going to conservatory deconstructed for me the mythology of the separateness of one genre or another of music, because they're the same chord changes and the same notes. And some of the most extraordinary popular music has come out of symphonic work or classical literature. You take that set of chord changes and you do something else with it. Billy Joel has taken several pieces from classical music. He studied classical piano for years and brought them, into contemporary styles. The Procol Harum, took a very famous classical piece and turned it into one of their great pop hits. Some would argue their only real great pop hit. But there's this interplay between genres, and that makes it rich. That makes it interesting. Is that, I feel like, I mean, a typical day at conservatory for me involved getting up in the morning and going to a dance class, whether it was jazz or ballet or tap dance or something, because performing arts majors had to study some dance, and I was terrible at it. There's a reason I'm in the band, but that's okay. It was still good exposure. I was doing, I'd have private voice lesson and I had my repertoire for that. I would be in a madrigal group and have repertoire for that. I was doing vocal jazz and had repertoire for that. There was music theater, there were operas, there was concert choir. There was any of the other music that I was doing on my own or making with friends, and all of it required that I apply myself in a very particular way as a singer, as someone who was seeking to understand how music works. And I'm so glad that my mom pushed me into that. She didn't have to push very hard. I'll own that. She didn't have to push very hard. And once I was in it, it just, you could just, I'm sure somebody near me could have seen the light bulbs just going off as I made the connection between an old big band record and chord changes that I was being asked to analyze in, a sonata rondo form of something, and, a madrigal from the Baroque period, and, late Renaissance, early Baroque, and I mean, there are all these things that I could sort of pick that apart and then go to a Dan Fogelberg song and go, oh, somebody said, I dare you to write a song using the 1812 overture. And he wrote one of his most beautiful songs. I met a lover at a grocery store on New Year's Eve and Christmas Eve or whatever it was, but there's you start to see those connections, and you stop to see that we have an opportunity as musicians to draw from so many different places to make our own music more interesting. And so I think one of the effects that it's had on me as a songwriter is that it's made me think, um, just, I would say, almost instinctively in a more complex way about chord changes and melodies. And it's driven me to be a much more melodic writer. Some people start with poetry and then go find a melody to go for it. I start with a melody that just, totally engages me and excites me and won't leave me alone. A melody that I become obsessed with. And then I figure out how to quantify the emotions that are attached to that in words. But it's always driven by the music. And I have to credit, I think, the exposure to so many different styles of music in my youth to connecting me to the idea that most of the really great songs throughout history have a phenomenal melody that won't leave you alone. And that drives the folk process, because a great melody gets passed on. Sometimes words are left behind, which is why you have Woody Guthrie taking a Leadbelly melody, and Leadbelly may have gotten it from, Leadbelly may have gotten it somewhere else. But he passes it to Woody Guthrie, and Woody Guthrie writes a different set of words to it, and that goes to somebody else who writes a different set of words, and thus we have the folk process. But at the heart of that is an engaged melody.
Absolutely. And, that was one of the things I was going to ask about, and you got to it without my going there. And that question of, words versus music, what comes first in the song. But I think it is a good point that you make about the way in which music transcends the words to some extent, and that it makes sense for that to be an important starting place.
I think it really is, because I think music is able to move us emotionally in ways that words can't. And I think the reason is because words, there's a linear, logical, or illogical use for intentional purpose of language, but it's left brain. There's a certain sort of linear process to it. And music is more right brain. And I think when we receive words, they hit the left brain, and the left brain acts as a gatekeeper and decides, what do I let in? What do I push out? Music hits us in a way that bypasses the gatekeepers and goes straight to our heart. It goes straight to our sense of intuition. And therefore, I think it carries a kind of emotion with it that transcends the words sometimes. And I mean, an artful songwriter can use music and words that are in a place of discord, in a way, for poetic or artistic purpose. But we can go the other way and work very hard to create something that just has such depth of synergy aimed in a particular direction. And that's what I think command of music gives to a songwriter, that distinguishes it purely from poetry. Now, that said, there's a lot of astonishing songwriters. I think now perhaps of Leonard Cohen or Tom Waits, who, as they have progressed in their lives, lost a lot of their melodic range and wrote songs that had very minimalist melody, and yet they could sing them with such depth of effect. And I think it's because the music was resident within them. And even as their ability to sing soaring melodies diminished, their ability to be very emotional in the way that they delivered something somehow increased. And they conveyed that depth of musicality in different ways.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. And, one of the things that then comes out of this question is, so you're thinking very musically, but your songs are also about something in the world in terms of their words. And so where, I know that social justice and labor issues have been important themes for you in songwriting and important inspirations, but talk a little about your inspiration for the poetic side of your songwriting, for the words.
I have to own that since the whole COVID era began, that I have been writing a lot less than normal. And part of that has to do with, for me as a writer, this may not be the way for everybody, but for me as a writer, I have to be willing to open my heart in a particular way in order to create new music. And it's just been harder for me to open my heart. I think all of us have been sort of on a defensive in some way. You know, we're keeping a certain amount of armor around because we keep hearing about friends or
Yeah.
colleagues who've passed or who are sick, or, you know, life keeps going on. People still wrestle with the ins and outs of daily life, only now it's more difficult. There's
Yeah.
more layers to it. And so I have not been as busy as a writer as I often am. But for me, it starts with an emotion. It starts with an emotional response to something, and then the music happens. Or sometimes there's a particular turn of phrase that comes with a specific melodic hook. Like I wrote a song about for the 100th anniversary of the Winnipeg General Strike. My buddy Mitch Podolak, who passed away about a year ago, was the founder of the Winnipeg Folk Festival and went on to found the Mayworks Festival, which spread across Canada, a celebration of working class history, really. And he invited me up for a festival in celebration of the 100th anniversary of the Winnipeg General Strike. And as soon as we got off the phone, this phrase came to me. Come gather, fellow workers, and raise your voice in song. We rise today in Winnipeg to sing our victory song. And the melody was there. And gather, fellow workers, and raise your voices strong. We rise today in Winnipeg to sing our victory song. You know, it was there. It was all there. But then I didn't know where the verses were because I didn't know the whole story. I just knew the emotion behind it, this sort of rising and the power of people doing something collectively. And then I let it sit for months. And then I was on an Air Canada flight from O'Hare to Winnipeg about 36 hours before I was supposed to be on stage. And I was like, oh, God, I promised Mitch I'd write a song for him. I better get on that. This is, you know, and when my inclination first would have been to do a lot of research about the history of the general strike in order to spin a linear narrative or ballad of some sort, I was out of time to do research, but I recognized that what I really wanted to connect with was not the intellectual piece of it, although that's part of it, but the emotion, the need for collective action and the power, the positive power of collective process. And I realized that I already knew everything I needed to know about that. And so I placed myself in that moment in time. I placed myself in 1919 as one of the workers. I would have had in my pocket this songbook that the IWW publish, Songs to Fan the Flames of Discontent, the Little Red Songbook. And I thought, okay, well, what are some of the songs in there, or the phrases or the things? And so I started lifting a few quotes in the way that a jazz artist might quote, you know, a Gershwin piece in a jazz solo, just as an homage. I started lifting a few phrases of poetry from some of the classic wobbly songs. So yeah, at some point it does become an intellectual exercise. You do focus on the words, but it's still driven by an emotion, the beginning of a song. And I think the ultimate power of a song for me has to reside in the authenticity of the narrative and in the way that it pairs with the music to park me in a particular place and time. You know, but that means if I'm writing a gospel piece, or I'm writing a civil rights piece that I want to feel like it comes out of the tradition, it's got a whole different vibe to it. You know, I wrote a piece called Where Are You, Moses, inspired by a lot of the songs, a lot of the spirituals and gospel songs, spirituals from, you know, the 1840s, I would say, on up through the 1900s, and the gospel music that really came out of Chicago in the 20s and 30s and early 40s. You know, to craft something that felt like it fit in that pocket. And it's, where are you, Moses? Where are you now? Come down from that mountain, Moses, lead your children home. and so as a songwriter, I'm all over the map, and people say, well, what kind of music do you write? I'm like, as good as I'm able. I mean, that's
Sure.
the short answer, because I don't want to be stuck in one hole. I don't want to be stuck in a genre. And, early in my career, I sort of got pegged as a labor artist or a lefty artist. And there were people who loved my music, but they felt like they couldn't book me because I was outspoken in ways that they were afraid of, because they didn't want to lose grant funding from conservative local business owners if they were presenting music that was too leftist on stage. And I just kind of went, okay, well, I know how to fix this. And in 2007, I released a singer-songwriter album that was the least political album I've ever released. And I put it out there to all the presenters and all the DJs, and sort of reinvented myself almost overnight, not as a political artist, but as a singer-songwriter. And that doesn't mean that I'm not carrying political messages with me. But you look at, I would say, somebody like John Gorka, who totally focuses on the narrative, on the story. And there's no record he's ever made that didn't express a political opinion. But he found a way to do it while being seen as a singer-songwriter, not as an activist per se. And I think you can do both. And I think most artists would side with me that you sort of have an obligation, if you have a microphone, to use it to say something about the world, not just about yourself. And so I write love. Somebody asked Pete Seeger once why he didn't write more love songs, and his response was, they're all love songs.
That's right. Yeah.
And I love that. But I do get that for some people, it's hard for them to see that singing, De Colores or Guantanamera or, whatever they're singing is in fact a love song, but it's a love song for a whole group of people. And so I learned from those traditions how to write a labor song that was also a song that humanized the people I was writing about, rather than being, sort of a dichotomy, an us versus them, an ideological entrenchment. I decided that if I was writing an activist song, that it was going to be something that told a very human story, and told it in a way that people could relate to it. That not just relate to it because maybe somebody who's a professor at university doesn't necessarily relate to a coal miner in a personal way. But if you tell the coal miner's story in a way that humanizes it and makes it just a little more universal, and places the emphasis on the human experience rather than just the trade or the labor struggle, it makes it more accessible. Likewise, I think the same is true the other way. A coal miner might not understand a professor's life, but you can tell the story of a professor's life to a coal miner in a way that helps them see the commonality. And you accomplish a lot of things all at once, because you're helping people see their commonality rather than their differences. And you're still celebrating the value of their individual experience.
Well, you've talked about playing different roles, being different kinds of musicians, right? Being sometimes a spiritual writer, sometimes a gospel singer, sometimes a singer-songwriter, and sometimes a labor activist. But there's another thing that you sometimes are, which is a band member. So talk to us a little bit about Brother Sun.
In 2010, a couple of mates and I, Greg Greenway and Pat Wichter, put together a trio. Pat and I had been playing together on and off since about 2003. And we'd been talking about putting a group together of some sort. And in 2009, Greg and Pat and I had an opportunity to sing together at a Unitarian gathering. And, it's like we all knew each other on the circuit, but it was the first time we'd all intentionally figured out how to do something together. And it was great. And everybody around us said that was magic. You got to do more of that. And we're like, yeah, that's great. And like a year went by, and, people are like, no, we really meant it. You have to do more of that. And so we pulled some rehearsals together, worked on some repertoire, put 3 or 4 dates on the calendar. They went pretty well. We put another 3 or 4 dates on the calendar. They went pretty well. And then we decided, okay, this is a thing that we're willing to dedicate ourselves to. And we spent another 7 years after that with that as the sort of the center point of our artistic work. And I think all of us in our own way doing various bits of solo work on the side. And, but it was a great experience. You know, I had spent a lot of time being in ensembles when I was younger, but I had spent, you know, the better part of 15 years as a soloist. I had a trad Irish band in Seattle for a while called Cúnla with several friends out there. And that was, you know, that was a great experience for me as well, to dive deep into traditional Irish and Scottish and Celtic styles, and to figure out, you know, how to work in ensemble with other people. And it was, Cúnla was very much a co-equal ensemble. You know, we had several front people, you know, we would just take turns. And that's really what we envisioned with Brother Sun, is that we were a trio with 3 frontmen, you know, and that meant that, you know, on 2 out of 3 songs, you're being a side player. And what a marvelous experience for all of us, largely soloists, to figure out in partnership with each other how to be very skilled supporting musicians as well. And it was a great run. We had fun, and we just reached a point where our sort of personal lives were pulling us in different directions, and our the things that we wanted to chase creatively were pulling us in different directions. And for me, I think I had an interest in getting back to much more direct political activism. It's not that we were apolitical. We certainly expressed a lot of opinions in our work, but it was one of those things I was talking about where the music conveys the heart of what's going on. And we were able to sing harmonies with each other in a way that sort of transcended the lyric content. So much so that sometimes people wouldn't even realize what a song was about. And I think that started to wig me out a little bit, that there was something about our personalities, and the harmonies got to a point where people were missing the deeper meaning of what was going on with the music because they were just drawn into the energy of it. And that's both beautiful, and like I said, for me, it was a little unnerving because I wanted to stay connected to a message. And, you know, but it's, we're all friends. We keep in touch, and it's been 2 years since we've been pursuing that. 3 years? Is it possible it's been 3 years?
Well,
wow. Yeah, it's been 3 years.
The pandemic makes you feel like this year didn't happen. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it kind of does. Yeah, but it's as of this month, it's our last concert was in the fall of 2017. So, yeah, it's been almost in November. So it's been almost 3 years, which is astonishing to me. But it was a great experience. It really was. It informed how I make music now as a soloist, and how I made music as a soloist informed what the trio was. You know, it was a very synergistic experience and a very positive one on whole.
Absolutely, that's great. And I think the first time I saw you was with Brother Sun, which is one reason I asked about it. But you know, at one of those Folk Alliance meetings over the years. But of course, I've seen you do your solo work as well. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your latest recording? Because that kind of bridges the gap in the sense that you had a lot of guests on that recording and worked with individual other musicians quite a bit on the different songs on that project.
Yeah, the most recent album of mine that was of my own material is called Poets, Philosophers, Workers, and Wanderers. And yeah, it's a really interesting album. It was a work that was in some ways kind of a magnum opus. I mean, you know, I'm only 48. I hope to outdo it, but for the time being, it's definitely, I would say, the most complex arrangements that I've done on a record. But in some ways, I think it was inspired by a lot of these big albums of this, like, late 60s and into the 70s, concept albums by some of the popular groups. So you look at like Days of Future Past and the Moody Blues, and the way that they incorporated symphonic elements into, you know, straight out singer-songwriter rock and roll, you know, but they brought this immense sense of composition to it. Or The Who with Tommy, or Yes. You know, Yes did some amazing concept albums. Alan Parsons did some amazing concept albums. And this was, for me, sort of a concept album. And throughout throughout the project, unexpectedly, there is a presence of a horn section and a string section alongside traditional folk instruments, the mandolin and the banjo. And John Carroll plays keyboard on that record. John's played on several of my albums, and he and I just are sort of a mind when we get in the studio together. There's an extraordinary sense of simpatico and common purpose. And I just hum things to him and he plays them, and
Yeah, he's really
I don't have
great,
to
isn't
chart
he?
things out for him. In fact, a couple of times I wrote charts for him. He's like, yeah, save yourself the time, don't do that. I got where you're going, and he really is a gifted musician, and that's a huge part of it. But he and I really feel things in a very particular way, and it's a very similar way. I went in 2007, that singer-songwriter album I mentioned, The Candle and the Flame. He was the last side player to come into the project, and he had the challenge of stitching the quilt together. But such a phenomenal job did he do on that the next record I made, I started with him. And I said, the heart of this record is you and me. Everybody else is going to have to find their place in it, because the center point of this is my singing and playing and your keyboard work, and the rest will sort itself out. But then when I did Poets, I brought John back, and I knew that he was integral, but I did want to go for a broader, slightly more symphonic flair in some of the arrangements. But I also brought in Cheryl Prashker, who is, among other things, the percussionist for the Celtic group Runa. And she too has a classical background, so she understood. She's done symphonic percussion, and when I told her I need you to make the baron sound like a timpani, she knew what I was talking about. And she, we figured out how to mic it and how to get a different set of mallets on it and get the sound of a timpani. So in some places I could get orchestral kinds of percussion on that to go along with the horn section and the string section. And so it was, but at the heart of that album, when you get underneath some of the musical choices and this sort of landscape, this vast musical landscape, again, are narratives that, narratives of working people, narratives of friendship, narratives of love, narratives of community, questioning the order of things, trying to figure out how to make things better. It's the narrative, I think, musically, that creates the background tapestry, and it creates the possibility for multiple narratives poetically that one would think are somehow not necessarily related to all fit together. And then you stand back and you look at all the puzzle pieces, and start to finish, it takes you on a journey. Tom Petty's album Wildflowers, I would say, was a huge influence on my album Poets, Philosophers, Workers, and Wanderers. And in part it was his use of a horn section and strings, not a full orchestra, but bringing in a brass section and a string section in certain places, that tied that album together. And he starts out just voice and guitar, acoustic, and it gets big, and then it just gets gentle but broad. There's a sonic arc to that Tom Petty album that still knocks my socks off start to finish. And when I was working on Poets, Philosophers, Workers, and Wanderers, I really wanted that sense. I wanted this to be a listening experience. And it's, we used to have that a little bit more with vinyl, when that's, people would think about the arc of how a record flowed. But in the CD era, now in the electronic music, where everything's files being passed back and forth and downloaded, people don't think as much about the arc of the whole album and how it moves. And just once in my career, I wanted to make an album that was based on that linear arc of where it takes you. But I was really lucky to get Issei Barnwell, who was with Sweet Honey in the Rock for decades. And it was funny, when I asked her about coming in the studio, I said, what do you charge for doing session work? And she said, I don't know. I've never done session work. And she's in her early 70s at the time. I was like, what? You've never done session work? She said, no, I've just always sung with Sweet Honey in the Rock, and we didn't pay ourselves for singing on our own records. We were scraping together the money to put the record out there and hope we made money selling the record. And so we talked about it a little bit. But I have to say, there was a song written by my friend Kat Eggleston that I was recording called "The Lady Juliana," about the women who were sent on prison ships from England to Australia. King George having this aha moment that if he wanted to colonize a continent, that he was going to need to send female prisoners as well as male prisoners, or it was not going to go very far. And it really is the story of those women and their journey. And that was the song that I think first grabbed Issei. And she said, yeah, I'll help you out with this project. And we had met on a union retreat. We're both members of AFM Local 1000. And so, yeah, I invited her to come on the record, and she was delighted. And she did some of the most astonishing and creative things, and lent just this depth to the vocal tapestry. My friend Tret Fury sang on that record. Yeah, it was really nice to bring together a community of colleagues to create something. Yeah, Kathy Fink and Marcy Marxer had some contributions, and yeah, it was marvelous.
Yeah.
It was
and Reggie was on there too, right?
Reggie Harris was on there. Yeah.
So a number of people who've been in our series before. Reggie Harris was in the same series as you, the Homegrown at Home series for 2020, and Kathy and Marcy have been in our series before on our stage. So it's nice to acknowledge our musical friends as well. But yeah, it is a great album, and exactly as you describe, it's clearly conceptualized as an album, not a bunch of songs that you just had enough to make an album, and so it was an album. It was a real a project of its own, an artistic work of its own.
Yeah. It's one thing I wanted to mention. When Issei came in for the session, she brought me a bottle of 19 Crimes wine, referencing, of course, the 19 crimes that could get one sent to Australia. And I asked her to sign the bottle, and she said, "Oh, no, you're not putting this on the shelf. If you're not going to drink this, I'm taking it back. It's a nice bottle of wine." And I said, "No, I promise I'll drink it, but I do want you to sign the bottle." It was just a little fan moment for me, but I just thought that was incredibly classy of her to, bring a gift to a recording session. I thought that was sweet.
So you've mentioned a number of times that symphonic music and classical music inspires you, and can also be the inspiration for a lot of great pop music. And one of the things that we're proud of is that it also works the other way. So one of the best known pieces of American classical music, which is the hoedown section of Rodeo, is a fiddle tune from the American Folklife Center archive, and that's Bonaparte's Retreat. And that was also then taken up by Emerson, Lake and Palmer. So we've got that whole arc. But that brings up a whole area, which is in fact the way that you and I met, and the way that you got involved with the center, which is the Archive Challenge. So we've been running this program for several years, in which we challenge musicians to learn a song from the archive or a tune from the archive and perform it in a special showcase at the Folk Alliance International meetings. And Joe, you've now done that 3 times, I think. So
yeah.
So what was that experience like, digging into the archive?
Well, it was great for me. I mean, I didn't even know about it until you had been running it for a couple of years, and then I managed to open some email and went, oh, hey, that's something I want to know more about, and reached out to you and to Jennifer. Yeah, it's just fun. I love all forms of music, but I feel like there's so much of our cultural heritage and history and musical heritage that shouldn't be forgotten. And innovation, I think, comes from a deep understanding of tradition. And you don't have to be a purist. When I had my trad band in Seattle, we'd treat a lot of the Irish and Scottish tunes like we were playing jazz. We'd play through the tune once, straight through the tune, and then we'd bust out into solos, and a couple of us would play the changes, and the soloists would do interesting improvised solos over the top of it, and then we'd bring it back around. And some people loved it, and some people just thought it was absolute heresy, like we were destroying a tradition. But what I love about the Archive Challenge is that you leave people the space to interpret traditions or to take things that are incomplete or impartial. The song that I did this last Folk Alliance, "Take This Hammer." There's a bunch of versions of that in the folk and blues canon, but mostly they only include two of the verses that the Lomax family recorded in the Rayford prison in 1939, because those are the two verses that were printed in a songbook, I think around 1941 or 1942. And that's, before these recordings were readily available to people, it was that songbook that became the source material. But it only included two of the originally recorded verses from the Rayford prison. And so going back now and having access to that recording and being able to transcribe, create some sort of transliteration from what I was hearing, it was really remarkable, because I think there's a depth of cultural idea that's carried in the original recording that is not present in the blues versions. It's not that they don't have their own unique place, but from a historical standpoint, they don't have the same weight. And so one of the things that's cool about the way the Folk Archive Challenge works is that you get to bring something forward in whatever way makes sense to you as an artist and still honors the tradition. So in that case, I lifted a verse that Flatt and Scruggs sang that I never found any other version of, except there was a version Odetta also sang that referenced a little bit about the shackles and chains, but that was not in the prison version of it, interestingly enough. But I didn't like how they sang it. It wasn't, to me as a poet, it wasn't mellifluous in the way that the rest of the song was. And so I took the concept, but wrote a new verse with it. There's a Leadbelly verse that he came up with. It was not part of the original prison recording, but it was a song that Leadbelly sang a lot, and so it felt appropriate to include his verse. And then there were a couple of verses that were just inaudible to me. Like I just, I'm listening with headphones and tweaking my sound rig as much as I can to accentuate sibilants and consonants, and I still just couldn't pull it out of the old Bakelite discs with the aluminum acetate on it. And I just couldn't lift it out of the bias on the medium. And you and Jennifer both said, well, hey, you're a songwriter, make up something logical. You know a lot about the genre, the medium, the history, like invent something that works. And it was great. And then I came up with, Lord, I'm coming to that Jordan water. Lord, I'm coming to that Jordan water. Lord, I'm coming to that Jordan water. Don't you let me drown. Don't you let me drown. And the only word I could hear clearly on the recording was the word drown. That was it. And so then I had to take the cadence of what was there and invent words to put into it. I'd call it anthropological songwriting. But there was something really satisfying for me. Again, somebody who, as a younger musician, had framed myself in a particular genre and said, this is what I do. It was, again, yet one more invitation to break down those concepts of genre and to do something different, and to tell a story that I wanted to tell, not just based on what was existing on the recording, but based on things I had read and understood about a particular people in a particular time and place. And so I think the joy for me of the Archive Challenge is that it invites us to view this music as a living tradition, not something that's set in stone. It's not ossified in a particular way. It's not a mosquito frozen in amber. It's something that is alive, and there's an inherent invitation to keep it alive and keep it current.
Yeah, it's kind of magical. I mean, you mentioned that certain forms of the song have become the standards largely because of being published in a book, and that was the case. I mentioned Aaron Copland and Rodeo before, and of course he got it from the book, not from the recording, which wasn't readily available in the 40s. But now we can make those recordings available, and it's like a time machine that you're actually hearing these people and what they said and what they sang in 1939, but it comes with that cultural distance and also the medium distance, as you pointed out, that the medium itself degrades and you can't hear everything that they said or everything that they sang. So you have to put some work into it, and we really appreciate what you did with our songs for your Homegrown at Home concert, which you did almost entirely, actually entirely as an archive challenge. I guess you did write one of the songs, but the rest was all archive
Well,
material. So
I didn't write the song. I wrote a few verses that were missing,
right,
which is what I did basically with all of the songs. There were, "Oh Ye Prodigal Son." They only recorded one verse and a chorus, and then Ruby Tyrrell Lomax had written on the dust jacket of one of these records another verse that she may have heard somewhere else, or maybe they sang it after the machine was off or before it was on, or who knows. They're working with these discs, and there's only a finite amount of time on each of those discs. And if they were getting toward the end of a disc, they may have just said, well, give us X amount, give us, you've got 2 minutes or 2.5 minutes or whatever. But it was the story of the prodigal son in Christian scripture, so there's a clear reference point for the whole narrative. And I think it was the Golden Gate Singers that you pointed me toward that had done a version of it, and that may be what Ruby Tyrrell was referencing when she wrote that
could be.
what was a third verse. But even they didn't have the second verse in there. But it's an important part of the narrative where the prodigal son leaves, realizes that even the servants in his father's house are being treated better than he is being treated in the world. And he goes back to his father asking permission only to be a servant in his father's house. And that's such a pivotal part of the story, and I couldn't figure out why it wasn't included. And so I studied the way that they use language and wrote a middle verse that infilled that piece of the story that would be endemic to the kind of language that was in these other bookend verses. And Battle Axe, the two songs that Gussie Slater sang, and so many of the singers are not recognized, or only one name is written down when clearly there's a whole ensemble. But in her case, her name was written down very precisely as the singer, and it was evident because the other name was a man's name. So you knew that she was the one singing. And why the man's name was there never made sense to me, because it's not like she had an accompanist or something. These were all a cappella pieces. But I think because Ruby was recording in the prison chapel with the women, she had a much more sound isolated environment and was able to capture something in better fidelity. So, and Gussie was a singer extraordinaire. I mean, I think if she had not found herself into the prison system, it's clear that Gussie could have had a career in music. I mean, she just had this amazing voice, and so her delivery was exceedingly compelling. And there were only a handful of words. Trouble is Hard and Battle Axe are the two songs that she sang that I recorded. And there were only a handful of words that I needed to wrestle with a little bit, but largely it was there, except for one verse. So in Battle Axe, in that song, there was a verse that seemed a little mysterious to me. One of the things that's interesting about that song is that Jesus is referred to specifically as doctor with a capital D. And the last verse says, A is for Almighty, that's true. B is for baby like me and you. C is for Christ sent from God. D is for the doctor, man of all. And this idea in the Christian tradition, Luke is often referred to as the physician. He was a doctor, but to see Jesus referred to specifically in the context of healer, rather than, a more salvific savior kind of language, but as healer, as doctor, struck me. It's a little bit unique in my studying of spirituals and gospel music, but there's a verse, when Mary was seeking for religion, she was only 12 years old. She was skipping over hills and knocking. She knocked at Abraham's door. And it just kept bugging me, like for days, for a couple of weeks. It just kept sitting in there as I was doing research and working on my arrangements. And my friend Kate Blaine suggested, there's something about that. Look through Hebrew scripture. And see what comes up if you just do some sort of index search on that phrase, knocking on Abraham's door. And I'm so glad that she thought of that, because I did some research then, and it tells the story of the mysterious travelers who come into Abraham's camp, and he and Sarah have been trying to have a child and they've been unable to do so, and they're asking for hospitality, and Abraham immediately recognizes that there's something unique about these travelers. and he asks Sarah to make bread for them, and he goes to kill an animal to feed them well as guests in his camp. And when they leave, they say that they will return in 1 year to help celebrate the birth of Abraham and Sarah's child. And so there's this mystical quality that's equated, but I kind of had to dig to figure out what's the relevance. What is this knock on Abraham's door thing? And then I felt compelled to write a verse, because not every listener is going to have that backstory or have that history. So I wrote a verse that said, just like Abraham and Sarah, Mary had her 11 sons. She brought to the world a savior. Now every battle's won. He's a battle axe. It's just only 4 lines, but it stitched the quilt together for me as a songwriter in a way that would negate somebody having to go figure out what this mysterious language was about. But the thing about songwriting, whether it's contemporary or historic, is that we're speaking in metaphor and allegory. It's a whole series of wiki links that are tied together in poetry. We're speaking in shorthand and in idioms. And if someone doesn't have the backstory, they're missing layers of meaning in it. And so part of the work with the Archive Challenge, I think, if you're taking it seriously, is to figure out not only what was said, but how do I translate it for people who haven't done the research I've done, to make it accessible to them, to have it be cohesive in a contemporary context.
So just to be clear and let the audience know, you performed the Archive Challenge essentially for your entire Homegrown at Home 2020 concert series concert. And we really appreciated how much work and thought you put into it, but then also just the beauty of the music, the beauty of your singing and your playing. We just really loved what you did. So I want to thank you for the concert itself. And it's also getting around time for me to thank you for this interview on behalf of the American Folklife Center at the Library of Congress. So Joe Jencks, thank you so much for the concert, for the interview, and we look forward to hearing more from you in the future.
Yeah, thank you, Steve, and thanks to Jennifer Cutting and Thea Austin and Todd and all the folks there doing an amazing job of preserving our cultural heritage and traditions and inviting us to carry them forward. Just amazing work going on at the Folklife Center there at the Library of Congress. And yeah, thanks for the opportunity. It was such a pleasure to dig into one specific point of reference with that project, with the Rayford Prison songs recorded June 2nd, 3rd, and 4th in 1939. And I hope to spend some more time in Rayford and resurrect some more of those songs. So thanks for the invitation.
Yeah,
thanks for all the work all of you are doing. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Joe.